In this presentation, we're going to discuss the logistics of selecting and calculating an appropriate enteral formula for your patient. There are many different products on the market, but the majority of the products are provided by either Abbott Nutrition or Nestle Nutrition. There are several other companies out there that have a variety of products, but they don't have as extensive of a formulary as these two companies. When selecting a product for your patient, you need to essentially evaluate the formulary and determine what product best fits the needs of your patient. Will a house formula do it, the standard tube feeding, or do you need a specific formula like a high protein formula or a disease specific like diabetic or renal product to use for the patient? The bottom line though is that you do need to select the best overall product for your patient. So the product that meets the majority of the characteristics you want for this particular patient is the product you should select. Just because your patient is diabetic, it does not mean you have to select a diabetic tube feeding. You may add other protein modules or additional items, supplemental, like if your patient has wounds to heal and you want to give some supplemental Juven on top of the tube feeding, you may do that. However, it's important to note that you can't remove anything from a tube feeding. So if your patient already has hyperkalemia, it would be wise to select a product that is lower in potassium because you cannot take potassium out of the particular product. Often the manufacturer will list nutritional components of the product in a per liter basis, as in it will note the number of calories per liter, grams of protein per liter, and so on in the particular product. A nice little hint is when you're doing your calculations for enteral recommendations, if you convert everything to a per milliliter basis and then you do your calculations by volume, you will never go wrong. An example is simply instead of 1,200 calories per liter, you're using 1.2 calories per milliliter. Instead of 54 grams of protein per liter, you're going to be use 0.054 grams of protein per milliliter when you're doing your calculations. So the quick way to determine the amount of calories, protein, etc. per milliliter is simply divide the liter volume or the liter numbers by 1,000. And again, using the per milliliter information when doing all of your calculations is really a quick way to come up with an absolute correct answer. When making enteral recommendations, I've got several little tips that I can provide you that will help you come up with quick, accurate information every time. You need to select the product that best meets the needs of your patient. You may not have a product that meets exactly all of the needs, but you need to look at the formulary and determine what product best meets the needs of your patient. Whenever you're making recommendations for enteral feeds, your recommended tube feeding must be within your estimated range for both energy and protein requirements. You will lose credibility if you cite that the patient requires a specific amount of calories or grams of protein per day and your product does not provide that to the patient. There may be reasons why the patient cannot tolerate the volume you want to give and therefore you can't meet the energy and protein requirements today. As long as you cite this, if you justify why you cannot meet those needs, you're fine. But your recommendations for enteral feedings must be within whatever you say the patient requires, or you're going to lose credibility with your recommendations. Tube feedings are not reordered every day, so you don't necessarily have to cite that the tube feeding is running at 75 milliliters an hour for 24 hours. In fact, if you do that, it means that your tube feeding will only run for 24 hours and then it will stop. And so again, when you're making your recommendations, if you say you're going to recommend, let's say, Parative at 75 milliliters an hour, that tube feeding will run at 75 milliliters an hour per the order until the order is changed to either have the tube feeding stop or have the rate run at a different infusion rate. If you're running the tube feeding for part of a day, you would need to cite how many hours per day you want the tube feeding to run, as well as the time of the day that you'd like the tube feeding to run, and that's always done in military time. So an example would be we want to run FiberSource HN for 18 hours every day. And so what we would recommend is we would recommend FiberSource HN at 18 hours from 1800, which is 6 p.m., until 1200, which is noon the next day. So you'd be running your FiberSource HN for a total of 18 hours at 90 milliliters an hour. The hourly rate really must end in a 5 or 0 if you're making a recommendation for an adult patient. Everybody wants to do quick math. This is how it's done in clinical practice, and this is what's expected in your recommendations. Also, if you're recommending volume-based feedings, that volume must also equal the hourly rate that you're recommending. This way, if for whatever reason the hourly rate is run for part of the day and then you make up the rest of the feeding as a volume, you want the volume to equal the 24 or 18-hour hourly rate. I hope this makes sense. So if you want the tube feeding to run at 45 milliliters an hour continuously, that would equal 1,080 milliliters per day. So if you're recommending a volume-based tube feeding, you would say you would like the tube feeding to run for to provide a total volume of 1,080 milliliters per day, or if it's going to run hourly, at 45 milliliters per hour. You could also go ahead and cite further that if this is only going to run hourly for 12 hours during the day, that you'd want this to run at 90 milliliters an hour for 12 hours. And then you would say maybe from midnight until noon. You would have to note the military time as well. And again, remember that energy and grams of protein must be provided as whole numbers if you're making recommendations for an adult as well. Again, we want to make sure that we're making recommendations based on how they're done in clinical practice. It's actually quite simple to calculate out a tube feeding. And I'm going to run you through a few quick steps, and hopefully this will be an easy process for you. Okay, the first thing you have to do is determine energy and protein goals. You should do this as a range, and again, whatever you recommend for your enteral feedings should provide nutrition within that cited range. So if you say the patient requires, let's say, 1,600 to 2,000 calories per day, and your recommended tube feeding provides the patient with 1,800 calories per day, you're right within your range. You're absolutely perfect there. The same would hold true for protein goals. So we've determined a range. How do we get the volume or the infusion rate based on that range? I'm going to give you a couple little pointers, and this is really simple. And again, I'm not using a specific product or a specific composition of formula for this particular example, but I just want to make this point. So again, let's say your tube feeding goal range is 1,600 to 2,000 calories. Pick a number in the middle. Any number in the middle of that range, it really doesn't matter. So let's go with 1,800 calories as your caloric goal. Let's say we have a 1 calorie per milliliter formula that we're using. And so if we ran that tube feeding continuously for 24 hours, we would give the patient a total of 1,800 milliliters to provide 1,800 calories, and that equates to 75 milliliters an hour. The same would hold true for protein goals, but let's just say whatever our protein goal rate is, the range is, let's say, 75 to 100 grams of protein. So we pick 85 grams of protein as our goal. But let's say now the goal rate of the tube feeding to meet that 85 grams of protein is 85 milliliters an hour. So you need 75 milliliters an hour to meet the middle of your caloric goal range. You need 85 milliliters an hour to meet the middle of your protein goal range. So you have a few choices. You can round up with your caloric goal to 80 milliliters an hour, round down to your protein with your protein goal infusion rate to 80 milliliters an hour. Since you picked numbers that were kind of right in the middle of your recommended ranges, even being off a little bit on the infusion rate, you're still going to be within your range, guaranteed. But if you go at the high or the low end of your range for calories or protein, and then you have to adjust that infusion rate a little bit when you're determining total goal of your tube feeding, you may end up either overfeeding your patient a little bit, or if you go down the lower end of that goal range, underfeeding your patient a little bit. So if you always select a goal tube feeding at the middle or very close to the middle of your range, even if you have to go up or down a little bit on volume, you're still going to be fine. I hope that makes sense. And if anybody has questions about this, please contact me. I'd be happy to explain this to you. So once we've determined that volume that's going to meet the energy and protein goals, we just simply divide that volume by the number of hours the tube feeding is going to run to get your infusion rate. So let's say the volume that we need to give our patient to meet the calorie and the protein goals is around 1,620 milliliters per day, and we want that tube feeding to run for 18 hours a day. You simply take this 1,620 milliliters divided by the 18 hours to get 90 milliliters an hour. That's our infusion rate. You multiply the volume then by the number of calories per milliliter, and the volume by the grams of protein per milliliter to get your total calories and total protein provided for the day. If you want to determine the amount of potassium this tube feeding is providing, you simply take the amount of potassium per milliliter and multiply that by the volume to get your the amount of potassium that this tube feeding is going to provide. It's really quite simple. So I hope this makes sense to all of you. And finally, when we are transitioning a patient either from an enteral feeding to PO or from parenteral to enteral, we want to make sure that we at least try and keep the protein intake constant. You may be a little high in calories one day, a little bit low in calories the next during this transition phase, but if you keep the protein intake relatively constant, that's going to be the best for the patient. You may go ahead and slightly give a few more calories one day, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to make that big of a difference. Ideally, if you're transitioning from parenteral to enteral feeds, it's really nice if you can have your parenteral formula approximate the composition of your tube feeding formula, and then it's just basically a milliliter per milliliter transition. For every 20 milliliters you go up in tube feeding, you go down by 20 milliliters in the TPN. So that's really simple. When you're transitioning to an oral diet, it's a little bit more of a challenge because it may not be possible to really guarantee that the patient is continually consuming a specific amount of calories every day. That's when things like protein supplementation may be beneficial to at least make sure the protein intake is constant with your patient during this transitioning phase. So again, this was a very brief presentation about the logistics of determining a good tube feeding for your patient as well as making calculations. If you have any questions, please contact me. Thank you.